Hi, my name is Maria Trujillo, and I'm the Human Trafficking Program Manager with the Colorado Huma Trafficking Council. I'm here to welcome you to Convicting Human Trafficking in Colorado, a panel discussion. To close out January, which is National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month, the Colorado Human Trafficking Council is hosting this expert panel. Before I turn it over to the moderator, I want to talk about how human trafficking is a sensitive topic and can be triggering. So please take care of yourself during and after this panel discussion. I also want to make a note on terminology. Our expert panel will be using the terms victim and survivor. Victim is used in a legal context because when a crime is being committed, there often is a victim of that crime. Survivor, survivor advocate, lived experience expert are terms often used in the anti-trafficking field to promote autonomy, person-centered language, and offer empowerment. We recognize that these terms are not perfect and do not cover the array of terms that might be preferred by a person with lived experience with human trafficking. Now, I would like to introduce our panel. From the Denver District Attorney's Office, Laura Mullen. She's the Chief Deputy District Attorney. And Adam Bechtold, who's a Senior Criminal Investigator. We also have two service providers with us, Crystal from Covered, who's the Program Director, as well as Mariana Koszorowski, who is the Executive Director of Alight. Now I'll turn it over to our moderator, Christian Gardner-Wood, who is the Chair of the Colorado Human Trafficking Council, as well as the Chief Deputy District Attorney with the Boulder District Attorney's Office. Christian, take it away.
Thank you all for your participation today in this panel discussion regarding human trafficking, and specifically a Colorado human trafficking case that resulted in a conviction. As chair of the Colorado Human Trafficking Council, my goal is to educate the public about human trafficking and work with other council members, organizations, and the community to prevent all forms of human trafficking. The case that we're going to discuss today involves a human trafficking for involuntary servitude conviction. It involves the victim, Ashley, and is a case that had indicators for both sex and labor trafficking, but really revolved around the control of the victim by the human trafficker. I expect our audience will hear that this successful prosecution stemmed from a strong investigation, the prosecutor's office having a detailed and nuanced understanding of Colorado human trafficking laws, and community support for Ashley that empowered her as a survivor to cooperate with a lengthy investigation and a lengthy prosecution. So to start with, Laura, as the lead prosecutor in this case, can you please describe the facts of the case that were presented in court and how they led to a successful conviction?
Yes, so this case started out in the fall of 2018 as what appeared to be a domestic violence case. And essentially it was between a husband and a wife. He was forcing her to engage in sex with others, sort of under force. And he would make her go out and have sex with other individuals, not for any type of exchange of money or value, but just sort of as a means to control her. And so there was a specific singular incident that involved her at her place of work, where he essentially through physical violence and force forced her to go in and have sex with a coworker. She then got back into the car with her husband, who was waiting for her outside of the business, and went home. The next day, she felt safe to sort of disclose to another coworker at the business, and the police were called. And so the police came, and initially this case was investigated as a misdemeanor harassment case because, frankly, they didn't really know what it was. And then over time, as we started to understand the dynamics of that relationship and understand the history of their relationship, what we learned was that this had been a decade-long domestic violence relationship that had included sort of him compelling her to engage in sex, most of the time not for any type of money or exchange of value, but purely just as a way for him to control her and let her know that he was in charge and that she was his property. And so all of that information was both in the original charging documents and then later kind of included in motions practice for us to be able to talk about the full history of the relationship. And ultimately, due to some amazing investigative work by investigator Adam Bechtold, we built a story that was beyond just sort of her historical account to support the charges and His attorney convinced him that it would be a good idea for him to actually accept a plea, and so he did take a plea to the highest charge, to the involuntary servitude charge.
It sounds like a great result, certainly. I want to follow up about nothing of value. So often when we think about human trafficking cases, we expect that there's something of value. How did that factor into your analysis or the analysis during the investigation?
It was really interesting because when this case came to our attention, and initially, as I mentioned, it came in as a domestic violence case. It went through the traditional course to a domestic violence detective at the Rose Andom Center, which is our kind of family resource center for victims of domestic violence. And they didn't know what to call this. It was not traditional sexual assault because the person who she had sex with was by his account willing and participating in the encounter. And they didn't know what to do with it. And when it came to my desk, because there was a recognition sort of at the police department that there was human trafficking indicators happening, we looked at it and said, we can't meet the statute in terms of sexual servitude because there isn't any exchange of value. There was no promises, there was nothing given to the coworker. And when we took a hard look at the involuntary servitude section, we recognized that this is really what was happening here, that it wasn't about money, it wasn't about compensation, it was purely as a means of him compelling her and sort of forcing her to engage in labor. The labor just so happened to be a sexual act in that occasion.
Great, and that makes a lot of sense. Adam, I want to turn over to you for a second. As the lead investigator with the Denver DA's Office Human Trafficking Unit, can you describe for the audience the collaboration between agencies and then the specific facts that really brought this to your attention? I think Laura's talked a little bit about it, but from the investigative standpoint, how did it come towards you?
Yeah, this is a huge case as far as the collaboration between multiple agencies. As Laura alluded to, it started off with the Denver Police Department, just initial 911 phone call. Officers responded to it and took the harassment. That's where it started off. So the collaboration got to the Rose Andom Center, where the initial detective who looks at the case was going through it. Something's not right. His gut was saying something's far more than just the charges that we have him arrested for. The prosecutor at the time, who was over at Rose Andom, reviewed the case and had the wherewithal to pick up the phone and call Laura and bring our attention to it. Again, it was something that they were trusting their guts. They were looking at something that just didn't quite fit what we call the normal, if you would, a normal harassment, a normal domestic violence situation. There was a lot of complexity to it. So when it comes into our office and we started investigating it, we started looking into it. There was a lot of social media. There was digital evidence that was provided to us by Ashley in the case. As we looked into it, we started realizing there's a lot going on. She had a couple of juvenile children, so we knew we had to address and look into that situation. What that brought in, we brought in the two lovely ladies next to us here and their services, which we'll get to them in a minute, but it was a huge collaboration for our office.
Absolutely. And it sounds like that knowledge, both by law enforcement and by that prosecutor at the Rose Andom Center, of what you and Laura do was important for them to realize they needed to get you involved and get Laura involved. Absolutely.
It was something that through the trainings that we've all had as law enforcement professionals and as the ongoing trainings, we're looking for is we learned the words, we learned to recognize what we saw as something just more than historically how we've investigated cases. And it was in that space, in that newfound language that we had, that we're like, you know what, this is human trafficking, this is what we have.
And interestingly, shortly before this referral, we had trained the full group of the domestic violence detectives at DPD. And so there was just that awareness in the background of those pieces that didn't fit neatly into a traditional domestic violence case.
Absolutely.
And I think that was helpful.
Absolutely.
I think that makes great sense. And to recognize it for what it was versus harassment, which we know as prosecutors and law enforcement is a very low-level criminal offense, which doesn't seem to appropriately capture the nature of the conduct that we're talking about here.
Yep. He was originally advised on a misdemeanor harassment charge, and it wasn't until weeks later that we actually filed a formal human trafficking charge against him, as well as sexual assault.
That makes sense, absolutely. Well, speaking of the collaboration and getting other agencies involved, Mariana, I want to turn it over to you and ask you some questions. You're the director of Alight, which is an organization that connects survivors to specialized legal services. Can you describe when you first learned about the case and then what you did from there?
Sure. A light got involved pretty early on. We got a call from Ashley December 11th in 2018. I believe she was sent by the Denver District Attorney's Office because she had a number of urgent legal needs. And a light's work is focused on connecting survivors of trafficking of all backgrounds, genders, forms of trafficking to free, trauma-informed, specialized legal services. So we have lawyers that work in over 20 different legal areas. And that was needed because Ashley presented with quite intertwined and complex legal issues. Her trafficker had actually started a number of legal proceedings in different jurisdictions. She was dealing with dissolution of marriage and fighting for custody of her child that she shares with the trafficker, dealing with criminal charges against her, really fighting for her own safety, for her child's safety. And it's very hard to go through the legal system on your own for that, for anybody. And if we're considering someone that's just been through an extensive period of exploitation, it's extremely hard. And so we paired Ashley in 2 business days to Carolyn Whitkiss, who is an attorney specialized in family law, and Emily Warren, who's an attorney specialized in criminal law. And they're with this law firm called WZW. And they have been amazing because they've been working with Ashley since that time, over 160 billable hours, what turned out to be 9 legal issues in 4 different jurisdictions. And so I think that really highlights what a long journey Ashley's been on and how many different legal consequences and legal cases she had to unravel from this situation. And it, again, it's incredibly difficult for any of us to go through the legal process alone, and to ask Ashley to navigate the system and all these different court dates, so many court dates, so many different types of courts, 4 different counties in Colorado. So having professional legal help was very important for her.
Absolutely. It's a great service that a light provides. I know we're talking specifically today about Ashley's case, but it sounds like this is something that we see in a lot of cases, and a light's purpose is to connect victims with legal services. Do you see this on a regular basis where legal processes are being brought up for victims where they need the services of these specialized attorneys on a regular basis?
Incredibly, yes. And I think a lot of times for trafficking, we immediately think of immigration legal services, which are certainly needed in the human trafficking context. But survivors have so many different nuts and bolts legal issues, because if you think about it, their lives have been attacked and destabilized professionally by their trafficker. And I say professionally because it's in the trafficker's interest to figure out how to make them more dependent, more vulnerable, and a lot of times they know how to abuse the legal system to do that. And so we see many survivors with a wide range of legal issues, from criminal records for crimes they were forced to commit, to child custody and divorce, as we were talking about here, coerced debt, identity theft, and many more that you'll be surprised by, but yes.
I can only imagine. How would an attorney get in touch with you or be able to provide services to a victim through the connections with a light?
We are always looking for qualified attorneys, and we ask them to practice and help survivors in the area of law that they already specialize in. We want them to bring their best skills and talents to helping survivors. Once they go through our vetting process and our onboarding process, we also then provide trauma-informed training, because we want them to have that additional component to be able to work with this population that does need specialized services in that way. But we have a whole onboarding process, and we're actually recruiting attorneys all the time, because we never know what will come in and we never know where. And so while we're based in Colorado and we have many cases in Colorado, we're also working with survivors in Colorado that have issues in other states, or survivors in other states that may also have an issue in Colorado. So we are always looking for qualified attorneys to join our network.
That's great. Fantastic services. Thank you. Crystal, I want to turn to you for a second. So Covered is an organization that assists survivors towards self-sufficiency. Specifically looking at Ashley's case, what did Covered do in terms of services provided, and how did you first learn about the case and become involved in this situation that we're talking about?
Yes, hello everyone. Covered's program is uniquely designed to be trauma-informed, survivor-informed, and empowerment-based. We help persons who 18 and over are surviving sex trafficking. Our mission is to empower towards healing, and we do that by providing housing, community, education, and counseling. We first met Ashley through a partner organization in March of 2019. We entered her into the first phase of our program, which is Engage, where we work on basic needs. She actually was experiencing homelessness, so we helped her get into emergency housing. It was crucial to her safety. When I first met Ashley, my impression, she was very agitated, angry. She was afraid to use her voice. She was impatient. So then next we entered her into our program, our second phase, which is Empower. And she became greatly determined. She began working on her goals, which included the court systems. She maneuvered a divorce from her trafficker. She was awarded full custody of her child, and while being interviewed for the criminal case. She also worked on life skills, parenting classes. She kept a steady job this whole time, and she still has that same job today. She worked on budgeting, and she also actively worked in counseling for the endured trauma. She graduated into the final phase of Thrive, which was in November of 2021. This is a one-year phase that we stay involved with the survivor to help them sustain their self-sufficiency. After Thrive, we invite them into our covered community for life. And if they choose to stay involved, they make friendships that are lasting and healthy. Ashley was a rock star. She really was. And it was an honor to be a partner organization because her protection came first at all times. So we just continue still today to work to be a part of her journey.
That's fantastic.
And I will say too that this case lasted 3 years due to a variety of challenges, including COVID. And Crystal and other advocates with Covered accompanied Ashley to over 36 separate court dates over the course of that 3 years, which was really tremendous. You can imagine how exhausting that would be for a survivor to hang in there for 3 years, oftentimes with all of the schlepping back and forth and trying to come down to a court date only to then have it be continued and to take hours off of work in her personal life. So they were a tremendous partner in supporting the legal process as well as sort of her personal healing journey as well.
Yeah, thank you.
That's great. Yeah, we know the legal process can take a long time, but 3 years tends to be at the outer end of that spectrum. Long time, 36 court appearances, probably a little longer than usual, but I think emphasizes the point of being in it for the long haul and needing folks like Mariana and Crystal to be there to advocate and meet the needs of our survivors. So thank you so much, Crystal. In thinking about it, talking about that time frame, you talked about these 3 different phases of Covered as an organization. How long does each phase typically last?
Well, they come in to a phase of about 30 days, 30 to 90 days. The second phase, which is really intense case management, and that can be anywhere from 1 to 3 years. And then our Thrive phase is up to 1 year. And then after that, we recognize that too many times a program is cut off and then they're sent out. And we made a determination that they really need lifelong support sometimes.
Right. Even though after 3 years the conviction may be there, the case may be done, doesn't change underlying potential trauma, doesn't change the basic needs that are there and the ongoing needs for self-sufficiency that Covered is focused on.
Well, and it's that community that they really need because their support system is gone, their family's gone. And
absolutely. And traffickers tend to be so great at bringing people away from those support systems and isolating them. So having that community and that sense of support is huge.
Well, and many times it starts as a child with their family and then moves into their teens and then into adulthood.
Absolutely. Another area that we regularly see when we're talking about prosecution of these offenses or investigation of these offenses is that we're talking about somebody that maybe is already vulnerable because they don't have those support systems, or they have other traumas or things going on in their lives that are making them vulnerable to a trafficker, or in this case, a husband that can then traffic them and force them or coerce them to do things that they may not want to.
I think the work that Cover did in assisting Ashley on the road to autonomy was really tremendous. When Adam and I first met her, she had never had a driver's license, wasn't allowed to drive a car, never had her own phone, did not have a bank account. And so it truly was that mechanism of complete control and isolation that made her extremely vulnerable and extremely dependent on her trafficker for everything. And through the process that she went through, she became incredibly autonomous, independent, powerful, and it was really amazing to watch.
She really did. And she, at the end, bought her own car and is driving, so it's really awesome.
The lawyers who worked with her were also commenting on admiring the growth, and that at the end she was such a strong advocate for herself during these hearings. I mean, that is quite the journey for anybody.
It was an evolution that we all watched.
Yes.
Yeah.
It definitely was. And her strength was something that, on the investigative side, was very admirable. Just to be able to sit back and watch and draw strength from it. And then to see the work that she was doing with Covered and with everybody involved, for me as the investigator, put me in a space where I could then just focus on the investigation without having to constantly go back to her for more sources of information. I knew from my investigation she was taken care of. Her growth was growing, everything was going good with her. So then the focus could be on just the facts that I needed to gather to present the case.
That's great, absolutely. A success story, no doubt. And to Laura, your point about an evolution, I think sometimes we talk about individuals as victims of trafficking, but really what we see is that evolution from being a victim of trafficking to really a survivor at this point for Ashley of the trafficking situation.
100%. And I think from the legal perspective, it certainly helped us tremendously because I could dig in my heels, and to make a plea offer that he had to plead to the highest charge, as you know, is not particularly advantageous. And oftentimes he would turn that down. But we knew that we were able to take that position because she was in a place that she could sort of physically, psychologically, mentally come into court and testify if we asked that of her, and she was prepared to do so. And so knowing that, and that we weren't going to be playing a role in re-traumatizing her or ask her to be doing something that she really wasn't capable of doing, empowered us to really dig our heels in and say, he can plead to this or we'll go to trial. And knowing that she was in a place where she was really feeling strong and resilient, that made our jobs tremendously easier.
Absolutely. Speaking from experience, I certainly know that is a tough transition to get into trial and have to talk to 12 strangers in a jury box about the trauma that you experience, particularly when we're talking about engaging in, sexual assault or sexual behavior that you don't want to. So fantastic situation here that we're talking about with Ashley. Speaking of that, Laura, I wanted to come back to you. So we talked a little bit about the difference of this case being sex trafficking versus labor trafficking, and that ultimately because of not having anything of value, you couldn't do it as a sex trafficking charge, but you did the labor trafficking. You mentioned, however, adding a sexual assault charge. How did that impact the dynamics of the case, and specifically the plea bargain and the fact that there was a successful plea in this case? Right.
Well, and I should add too that the involuntary servitude, or what we refer to as the labor trafficking charge, was somewhat of a creative charging decision at the inception of the case when we were operating on the information about what happened in a singular date of offense. Over time, we learned that there had been a long-standing history that did include some exchange of kind of commercial sex for things of value. So I did add the sex trafficking charges down the road in addition to the sexual assault and the labor trafficking. And so obviously in Colorado, sexual assault is an indeterminate crime, which means that there is no kind of cap or ceiling to the sentence. So that if he was convicted of that at trial, then he wouldn't be guaranteed any type of a maximum sentence. He would essentially be in custody until the Sex Offender Management Board would decide he was eligible or appropriate for release. That changes the dynamics, as you know, in these types of convictions and these types of cases. And so I think that was certainly helpful. And I would imagine, although I'm not privy to his conversations with his attorney, that the concession of him not pleading guilty to a sexual assault was perhaps still seen as, a helpful concession for him. But we felt like it was really important for him to plead guilty to the labor trafficking section, because I truly felt that her experience was embodied in that section, in that statute. This was never about money. This was never about him sort of profiting off of her. This was purely about his sort of means to control and use her as he saw fit, and then, to either inflict violence or threaten violence as a means to, get her to do what he wanted. And so we really felt like, while we did have some evidence to support the sexual servitude charges as well, that this case was really about that forced labor. And so ultimately, that's why we had that conversation with Ashley. Every step of the way we talked to her, and that's really important to make sure that she felt like justice was being served with this plea. We wanted buy-in from her. We wanted her to feel like this was a good outcome, and she agreed and felt like this charge truly embodied her experience.
Absolutely, and a serious charge as a Class 3 felony in the state of Colorado.
Absolutely.
And
Yes.
on her personal side, the sentence for 10 years, she had a goal in mind, that he would be there in prison until her son graduated from high school. Then he could make his own choice. And that was really her goal.
And that an important goal certainly makes a lot of sense, particularly as Mariana talked about going through the issues of a child custody case and a divorce case, all the while wanting the child to get older, to be able to understand what was going on and what the history was in this situation.
There was a significant amount of manipulation both by the trafficker and his family as it related to the custody of their child during the pendency of this case. And that's why it was particularly important for Carolyn and Alight to be involved, because Ashley needed her own advocate to protect her in that regard. And as you can imagine, that control over access to her son had been used as a means of coercion and control for many years. And so to have a legal advocate who would not only help her navigate that, but for us to say to her, you can now move forward with your life, and you can have your son at home, and you will know he is safe and he is removed from his, his father, the trafficker's sort of reach and influence until he is an adult, was everything that she wanted in the resolution of this case. And we crafted that sentence based on that sort of demand by her.
It makes a lot of sense. Not to get too far into the nuances of Colorado law, but with that charge, we have the ability in Colorado to have a domestic violence factual basis to charges or a sexual factual basis to charges. Did that come into your decision-making around a plea at all?
Yes, and we actually did both.
Great.
We did a domestic violence factual basis as well as a sexual factual basis. We felt like it was very important that he register as a sex offender, because that is truly part of his nature, and it was important to Ashley that when he was released into the community that he did receive supervision accordingly, as well as treatment specifically in that arena, but also because he was chronically violent as her partner, both before they were married and after. We believed it was important for him to not only receive domestic violence treatment on parole as well, but also to be tagged as a domestic violence offender, so that if in the future he was to repeat the same behavior, then there would be circumstances and there would be the ability to aggravate him as a result.
Absolutely. Appropriate result all around, it certainly sounds like. To all of you, I wanted to ask, you certainly all played an important role, and we've talked a little bit about the various roles that you all played in bringing this case to justice. But as we talk about generally the idea of supporting a survivor, bringing a case to justice within the criminal justice system, what do you think is important for our audience and for Colorado residents to know when we're talking about the fight to combat all forms of human trafficking? Adam, I'll start with you first.
Certainly, yes. So it's something that a big takeaway that to have is law enforcement cares. we're out there, we came into this profession as somebody who cares, who wants to make our world a better place. And as we go into the human trafficking space, it is something that, while we may not have had the words for it, we're now learning. We're now learning to identify what are some of the factors, what are some of the signs that we have seen previously that we didn't have the words for. We didn't have an understanding of what it was we were grasping. And in that space, that we're doing a lot of stuff. We're tearing down the walls of isolation in the professional, the government sphere, right? Historically, it's law enforcement does one thing, everybody else is kind of pushed aside. But in the human trafficking area, we're doing a lot. We're partnering with organizations like Alight and Covered, and realizing that it's a much more holistic approach to dealing with the human trafficking, both in the investigations before, during, and after. And it's something that, as somebody in our society, the biggest takeaways we saw it in this case is they saw something there, they didn't know what it was, but they trusted their gut. And they knew something wasn't right, and they just picked up the phone and they made a phone call. For this case, they called our office. For somebody on the street, I encourage you, call the hotline number.
And it certainly sounds like, to your point, just getting a successful prosecution or a conviction in a case doesn't solve the problems for victims. We need services like Alight, like Covered. We need that support, and we need to be able to help the victim on all fronts with a divorce case, with a child custody
Absolutely.
case, with getting a driver's license or a cell phone or a car. And a simple conviction doesn't do that. So that partnership that you all formed, I think, is key to the area of success, and generally when we're talking about how to combat human trafficking.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Mariana, with that idea of, the success you saw here, what would you say to Colorado residents and those watching today about the important takeaway and the important message for combating human trafficking?
Even after someone exits a trafficking situation, that person is still not free. Even if the trafficker is arrested or jailed, that doesn't mean that person is free. Their freedom ends up being impacted going forward because there are so many consequences to trafficking that end up following them. And so I really want to emphasize that the story for these survivors really lasts, sometimes for many years, like for Ashley. Their journey forward is a very long process. And when you think about what does it take to bring someone back just to ground zero, to having their basic rights to safety enforced, to having all the regular opportunities that we have open to us, to be able to fully participate in society, it takes more work and more services to bring survivors to that point. And particularly with legal, a lot of times legal services aren't often immediately thought of as a part of that healing journey, because there are so many parts to that. Housing, mental health, services, casework. But legal is a critical component, because if you don't take care of these legal obstacles, they will continue to haunt the person going forward, blocking their opportunities. Last year, a study came out from the Legal Deserts Report of 550 organizations in the US that claim to serve survivors of trafficking with legal services. And the study found that only 16 in the entire country confirmed that they provide legal services focused on human trafficking survivors, because you really do need specialized trauma-informed services for this population. And so with Alight being one of those 16 in the entire country, I really want to stress how important legal services are. We need more lawyers, we need more attention to legal help, and legal needs to be part of that picture of healing for survivors.
Absolutely. Wow, 16, that is amazing what you do, and I'm glad that we have those services here and all the work that you're doing for the folks here in Colorado.
Thank you.
Crystal, with Covered, in your experience doing direct service with survivors and helping them, what do you think is important for our audience to know generally when thinking about the fight to combat human trafficking?
I loved what Adam said, that the partnership is crucial, and the legal services is crucial. We can't do everything, and we want to support a survivor holistically. So what's really important for us, for partner organizations, is to be trauma informed. You have to know how trauma affects the brain. in order to provide that very needed counseling and therapy. Being survivor informed is really important to cover. We believe survivors are the experts in this, and we have a survivor on our board, we have survivors in our program, and they speak into what we do, and that's really important.
So they're allowed to provide guidance to understand what should happen during those 3 phases that you talked to our audience about before.
Absolutely.
Great.
We had also talked to take a step back about this idea of being trauma informed as well. Could you talk a little bit about survivor informed versus trauma informed, and how those are different, and how your organization seeks to do both?
Trauma informed really is about how the trauma that they've endured their whole life has affected their brain. Their actual chemical is changed, which can be healed with the right type of therapy. Survivor informed just means that survivors get to be the expert. They get to speak into your program. They get to say what they need. They need to be empowered. They need to move from a victim into being a survivor and all the way to thriving. And they really get their life back then.
Absolutely. And thrive is the perfect word, and particularly for that last segment of your program, for sure.
You know what I think is interesting, Christian, too, from the investigative perspective, right? And law enforcement is doing a better job of understanding what trauma-informed means as we're investigating crimes, particularly investigating human trafficking crimes, because the historical model is, when you have a victim of a crime, whether it be a sexual assault, a domestic violence, or a robbery, that the first thing you do is try to extract as much information as you can from that victim to understand that circumstance. And when we first met with Ashley on this case, it was so apparent that this was someone who had endured such a long-standing trauma that was not going to happen. We were not going to sit and subject her to a 5-hour interview. And so the question was purely about needs and how we could direct her to services, how we could assist her in feeling safe, most importantly, and then starting to kind of provide some of those holistic opportunities that Adam talked about that were so critical. And it was a solid year into the case before we ever sat down with her to start to ask her some additional investigative questions, because we recognized that was not going to be constructive, nor was that going to be in any way helpful for her at the time.
Absolutely. With that in mind, thinking about the success that this was in terms of bringing this case to justice, does that happen without the partnership and without being survivor informed, trauma informed, getting services, meeting those essential needs that we talked about?
Absolutely not. No, and I think that we are, it's important for people who are watching this to know that we are really fortunate in Colorado that we have so many task forces. We have law enforcement agencies who are devoting personnel and staff to investigation and prosecution of this crime, and that's not happening across the country, frankly. When we started our unit at the Denver DA's office now about 4.5 years ago, so it's still very young. One of the things that we did, Adam and myself, is we talked with task forces across the country, and they were sharing sort of successes and challenges, and by and large they were saying these are really hard cases because they take a long time to get to trial, and by the time you get to trial, oftentimes these victims are not wanting to be part of it, right? Mm-hmm. Or they've lost contact with them. They're struggling with substance use, so many things, right? And so ultimately they couldn't proceed forward with a case because they weren't able to support the survivor in the way that they needed to. And that's why it's really critical to have all of these collection of professionals and agencies who can play roles, with the focus being the health and well-being of the survivor first and foremost, beyond the lifeline of the case. And ironically, when you focus and you are sort of trauma-informed and you really just serve that person and you put them first, even if that means that the case can't go forward, ultimately it ends up helping our cases because they are able to participate if and when we need them, and they are in a much healthier place. So yeah. I think it's critical.
Having trauma-informed services that are trauma-informed across the board, I think that's part of the picture, because as you said, trauma is having a very real impact on that person, and we have to be aware of how that's affecting how they appear, how they can participate. and then having the professionals working with them know how to make adjustments for that trauma, because it's not a typical case to investigate, right? It's not a typical client to work with. These are very complex, high trauma situations. The domestic violence cases appear differently with complex trauma. And so trauma-informed services across the board make a huge difference.
It's really hard for them to unscramble the information and bring it out. So that support, meeting their basic needs and their safety, helps them to begin to tell their story.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and helps then to get folks like Adam and Laura involved to then get into the criminal justice system, but they're not able to do their job if they can't unscramble that information or get through the trauma to provide the historical information they need for a case.
Exactly. As we talk about trauma-informed, one of the components of trauma-informed is, as the investigator, it's my job, it's my role to present the facts. I don't have to rely on what our victim is saying. And in this case, we didn't have to rely solely on Ashley's testimony to present the case in the criminal sphere. Again, re-traumatizing, re-bringing it open. It's my job as the investigator, as the professional, is to do that role. Her job is to just be with them.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And Adam built an amazing case just looking at, web browsing history and social media returns, email returns, and those tell a story separate and aside from what Ashley ever had to tell us. And then we could just simply ask her for clarification down the road as it applied.
And how does that play into having a successful case when you have that sort of background information that Adam is able to get versus simply relying on the story of a survivor? As compelling as it can be, and as much as you may believe it, how does that impact the case when you're trying to put it in front of 12 strangers that are sitting in a jury box?
I mean, for a lot of reasons. I mean, it certainly helps in the plea negotiation stage because the defense attorneys understand that we have a lot more than just putting someone on the stand, right? That they can't get up and cross-examine that person and poke holes in what they said or, potentially intimidate them enough that they won't come and then the case goes away because all of those records speak for themselves. And so what we've done historically is Adam can come in and testify and present all of this information in a really kind of professional, safe manner. And those records, they speak for themselves. And so they also then corroborate and support what the survivor is saying about their experience because we can go back through phone records, we can look at GPS, we can look at a whole host of the sort of digital trail that's out there that supports exactly what she told us. And it gives great credibility and weight to a survivor's account without them maybe having to be on the witness stand for 7 or 8 hours, like we used to see in a domestic violence case.
And it also provides a staying power as, 36 court appearances over 3 years. It's something that the evidence that we had built up was something that it could stay. It didn't expire. It wasn't relying upon an individual's recollection of something. It just could stay there to allow the case to go the duration of it took at Ashley's pace.
Absolutely. One thing I wanted to talk about that you had brought up, Laura, that I think is important, you talked about that idea of being trauma-informed and being willing to meet a survivor's basic needs. I think so often in the years that I've done this, sometimes alongside you, which has always been a pleasure, is people feel like if they call law enforcement, if they're working with district attorneys like you and I, that means we're going to sit there and say this case has to go to trial and there has to be a certain result. And I think so often I've seen victims who say, that's not my end goal. My end goal is not prison. It's not necessarily even a conviction at trial. That was a success, certainly in Ashley's case, but a lot of times it's, how do I end the abuse? How do I end the trafficking situation? And how do I get the help that I need from folks like Crystal and Mariana? Is that still something that folks can get if they call your office or if they call Adam?
Absolutely. And one of the things that we did at the inception of our unit, because we have an acute awareness that many victims of crime, but particularly victims of trafficking who may have been involved in criminal activity themselves as part of their exploitation, do not trust law enforcement, do not want to walk or work with law enforcement, and are very fearful about the ramifications of that. Not to mention that they fully believe that the things that their trafficker has said to them will come to fruition if they participate. And so from the beginning, one of the sort of mantras that we had, I guess for lack of a better word, from our unit was we would go out and we would meet with survivors and we'd say, we will never compel you to do anything. We will never force you to come into a courtroom. If you want to just provide information so that we can investigate this person independently, and we now have them on our radar and we can charge them with drug crimes, we can charge them with money laundering crimes, but we will take them off the streets and protect other victims, we'll do that. If you don't want a criminal prosecution, but you just want access to resources, we'll do that. We have these partners, we can make referrals. If you just need safety, immediate housing, and you need us to move you, if you need to be in the witness protection program, we can do that. And we really take direction from the survivors about what they want sort of that course to look like. And interestingly, what I have found is that by giving them that power, which they had taken away from them, right, which is the opposite of their experience for the duration of their trafficking, that usually, in the end, they actually do want to be part of a prosecution when they feel like they can trust us, when they feel like we have their best interest at heart, and when they feel safe. And we've had good success. But yes, that's never part of the equation, that if they don't agree, we won't help them. We never force anybody to be part of a criminal case. And many times we have cases that we've been able to start against traffickers, and we then find a whole collection of additional evidence that we can use to charge them, even if it's possession as a previous felon of a weapon. We can have them taken off the streets, and that survivor and oftentimes many others who they're exploiting can feel safe, and then that's a victory, right? And that person never even had to sit down for an interview. They never had to come into court, and oftentimes the trafficker never even knows that they communicated with law enforcement.
Now, one thing that you had said that I think is important for our audience to understand, and for maybe survivors that ultimately see this recording, is you talked about survivors maybe not wanting to work with law enforcement because of what their trafficker said may come to fruition. What we know sitting here, we kind of know what that means, that there's been threats about, well, if you report me, you're the one that's going to go to prison because you've committed other crimes, or I'm going to take the kids away and the courts are going to award me custody, and I'm going to divorce you, and I'm going to take the car, and I'm going to take the house. Is that kind of what you're talking about when you say those things kind of come to fruition if they report?
Exactly. Or, that their lack of status is going to be exposed and that they're going to be removed from the country. Or that that there's so many different kind of perceived actions that people believe their trafficker can take and that they've threatened to take, or that they'll just expose them maybe to, coworkers or their family members, share intimate videos or pictures. And so the survivors who we engage with truly believe that that's the reality and are oftentimes very hesitant and disinclined to speak to law enforcement. Also, there's a recognition that there are many survivors who we've worked with who've been part of the criminal justice system, for instance, as a juvenile, which is what made them particularly vulnerable to a trafficker. And it wasn't a pleasant process for them, right? They were seen as an offender, and in their mind that cemented sort of an us versus them feeling. And it takes a lot of time and building rapport and trust, and us only promising what we can deliver on for them to trust us and sort of recognize that we aren't the enemy. But absolutely, that's exactly right. And unfortunately, we have seen some of those things happen, where somebody will come forward to the police and then maybe they'll be physically injured by the trafficker as a result, or moved out of state, what have you.
As it relates to that idea of a survivor being charged with an offense or removed from the country, that sort of thing, which I think is sometimes the threat from the prosecutor. Adam, as a law enforcement officer, if a survivor comes to you and is asking for help and saying, I need out of this situation, are you focused on trying to develop their crimes and take them into custody or look at them as an offender? Or how are you helping them at that situation?
Absolutely. So on that the initial intake, if you want to call it that, where somebody reaches out and says, hey, I need help, my first and foremost concern is going to be for their safety. And what does that safety look like? Is it, as Laura talked about, intimate setting at home where the trafficker is, as in Ashley's case, her husband? That's something that is very important to know. It's something that we just can't arrest, take off the street, and then go from there. We're going to do much more of a long-term, when I say long-term, we're going to do a very good questioning of what does home life look like? What is coming to me, even this conversation that we're having? What is that? What ramifications is that going to have? Do I need to get a second phone? Maybe it's, with cover, getting a second phone of means of communication with them, because the primary means of communication is controlled by the trafficker. So there's a lot of factors that go into the safety of the victim survivor, before we even broach the conversation of having a criminal investigation. Once we feel comfortable and they feel comfortable, we're on the same page, then we'll proceed forth with a criminal investigation. And that's when, for me, the fact-finding comes into play. But prior to that, it's the victim's safety and their well-being is first and foremost.
And with that fact-finding, that's not focused on fact-finding of wrongs that maybe the victim had done, which is what the trafficker is threatening them about, but rather a criminal investigation and fact-finding about the trafficker and developing that type of case.
Absolutely. It's viewing it through the lens, viewing it through, in our conversations with them, what exploitation has occurred. What facts can we pull up from that? Is it, and when I'm looking facts, I'm looking external, something not dependent upon their testimony. That can come from a multitude of places, business records, surveillance, just those sorts of outside entities. That's what I'm going to be looking for first and foremost.
And as a regular course of practice, I would say probably almost weekly, either Adam or our other investigator in our unit or the police department detectives or the FBI will reach out to me and ask me to sign a letter of immunity, essentially sort of letting someone know that as part of their conversation with us and talking to us about their exploitation, that I am sort of offering them immunity or a guarantee that they are not going to be charged for any of the information that they share with us about them committing criminal acts, because it's part of the story, right? And if they're worried about, oh, and I also sold drugs or I recruited other victims, which happens, that they can be sort of fully honest with us without that concern about implicating themselves criminally. And I do that very regularly.
That's great.
Definitely. I mean, the exploitation occurs in many forms, many shapes, and one of the things we have through the collaboration is not only with Alight and some of the other agencies, but the federal agencies. If immigration is an issue, we can work with Mariana as far as immigration attorneys, or whatever the concern that the victim survivor is bringing to us. We have in our tool belt, if you would, different tools to help alleviate and help address those concerns.
That's fantastic. Part of that holistic approach that we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
Great.
I think a good point too is they have their own advocates that can help with that process, and that really helps the survivor. The whole community, they need a lot of support.
Right. They have advocates both within and outside of the system.
Yes.
I mean, if we look at who's sitting here today for Ashley, and we're not even the full extent of the team, but it's a long, hard process. She really does need a lot of services, and we're just probably the tip of the iceberg of our own agencies, and there's even more actors that were involved.
Absolutely.
It's important too that one of the recognitions of how important it is to have community-based advocates work with survivors is that they have that full privilege, right? So we can refer a survivor to a community-based agency and they can work with those advocates. Those advocates have no obligation to disclose anything that survivor says, whereas the advocates within our office do. And so if somebody shares something that is pertinent to the case, I have an obligation to turn that over. So it's all the more important to be connecting survivors with those advocates that they can have full confidentiality and privilege with, because traditionally in our system, that's not the case. And so we have to be very careful about disclosures because the defense has the right to hear about them.
That's right. And I think it just keeps going back to those essential services, those needs, and this holistic approach. And that approach isn't just about a conviction. It's not just about law enforcement, DAs, the criminal justice system. It's about Ashley and making sure that she's secure, she has her needs met, and she's able to thrive and move forward.
Yes.
So Laura, I wanted to give you an opportunity. I gave the other panelists before your moderator got off topic to talk about generally for our audience, what would be the key thing that you think they should take away when thinking about the fight against human trafficking?
Well, oftentimes we say this is a crime that's hidden in plain sight, and that is true. And so people hear that a lot. They've heard that with the awareness campaign that the Governor's Human Trafficking Council has put out, but it is true. And I think it's important for people to recognize that this is a crime that happens in all different kinds of communities. And importantly, the victims of trafficking themselves don't identify as such. And that's something that makes it really difficult. That I can say myself, historically, being in the district attorney's office for many years, I missed this in cases. I missed it when I was, a domestic violence and sex crimes prosecutor. And looking back, there were indicators that I just didn't understand. We're doing a better job of it. But I think that's really important for people to understand that this crime is sort of occurring both, in our communities, in our professional lives, and when we sit down with survivors, and Ashley is no different when I explain to them what the charges are. They're always really surprised because they've never identified their circumstance as human trafficking. And that makes this a challenging crime to understand and to recognize. When cases come in to law enforcement or to community service providers, they oftentimes come in with whatever the most pressing need is, whether that's an acute, injury from a domestic violence incident that day, or a sexual assault or a theft. But usually survivors report because of something that happens as an immediate threat to their safety, but they're not disclosing, and certainly no one is picking up the phone and saying, I'm a victim of human trafficking. That just doesn't happen. And so it's really about the collective awareness and sort of raising everyone's education about this subject, and for all of us to understand kind of how it presents, and then how to greet a survivor when you are encountering them, how to provide these services that we've talked about today, so that we can then really start to unpack it and be able to hold somebody accountable, to be able to help that person get out of that situation. And it is very challenging and complex, but I think it's good for people to know that we are in a tremendous position in Colorado, because we do have a lot of professionals who are well trained and who know how to work these cases, how to treat survivors and victims in a trauma-informed way, and that's the exception, unfortunately.
That's great. Absolutely. This idea that it's happening in plain sight, and we may not have victims calling 911 to ask. And it goes to the point of why we're doing this panel discussion today around Human Trafficking Awareness Month in January, and that we want folks to know what human trafficking is, what to look for, and what to do. And with that in mind, lastly, Adam, I'll turn it to you. As we're wrapping up our panel discussion, if a member of the public becomes aware of a trafficking situation or they witness something, what should be their next step?
Yeah, so thank you. So if you witness something, if you see something, if it's imminent and it's going on right now, call 911. That is going to be the first stop, absolutely, without a doubt. If you feel that somebody's in danger, call 911. If it's something that maybe the danger is not imminent, pick up the phone, call the human trafficking hotline. What that does is that gets sent to a number of us in the law enforcement community throughout the state. And then we deconflict amongst ourselves, and then we start our investigation. We start looking into what it is that you witnessed, you observed, that your feeling is. If it's something that you're feeling, again, pick up the number, call the human trafficking hotline. That being said, please don't engage in yourself. Don't get in the middle of it. Learn from law enforcement. We've done it for a long time. We're trying to singularly stop the situation by wresting our way out of it. One single entity cannot stop the situation. It takes a holistic approach for everybody to get involved with it, to make a dent, to make an impact in just one person's life.
Great advice. Thank you so much for that, Adam. And thank you to all four of our panelists for giving your time today and engaging in this important discussion and giving the insight to our audience. And thank you, all of us, for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you to all our panelists for participating in this important discussion, and many thanks to Christian for being our moderator. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. We hope you learned a little bit more about human trafficking. After this Facebook Live streaming event, this recording will be available on the This is Human Trafficking YouTube channel. If you have any questions for the Human Trafficking team, please contact us at info@thisishumantrafficking.com.